The concept of vertical force we know is hugely influential in golf in areas such as, for example, rotation, kind of club head speed connection, for example, between kind of ball and club. So what we look at then is very much the idea of those kind of ground reaction forces, how those feet are kind of locally leveraging the floor to produce those vertical forces. However, a much more hierarchical approach is to look at really almost those systems that sit above, what in many ways is influencing and creating the response and reaction of the feet through the floor. So certainly say within golf coaching, we often have this approach kind of a stimulation almost versus kind of inhibition and prevention. So stimulation, how do we get more rotation? How do we get more speed? How do we get more vertical forces? And that's an approach. Often a much more organic approach, a much more helpful approach is what's inhibiting, what's preventing rotation, vertical force, speed, for example. So often when we look at, say, these kind of movement connections that we have, one of the biggest almost inhibitions and biggest preventions, biggest constraints in some ways of our ability to produce vertical force is kind of how we move through that lead shoulder, especially kind of in that kind of downswing phase. As an example, using that line on that lead shoulder we have at address now, that when that kind of lead shoulder moves excessively ahead of or in front of and remains ahead of and in front of as you move into impact, that can be a tremendous conflict then in our ability to produce those vertical forces. Why? When that lead shoulder gets excessively kind of ahead of its kind of start position, it compresses, it pushes down that lead hip, which is trying to be pushed up in response to those vertical forces. That lovely kind of conflict that we have. The lead shoulder moves excessively ahead of, it drives the pelvis down, it compresses that lead hip downwards as those vertical forces are kind of trying to push us up. So an approach we can use to then really, again, it's the idea of allow, very much kind of encouraging and allowing then those vertical forces to be produced, is almost kind of using that line at that kind of lead shoulder, that start position. And as we kind of move into an approach impact, it's allowing that lead shoulder to be back to that kind of start position in the impact phase. So that then really allows then both the production of and also the application of those vertical forces to both be also produced and also applied. So once again, an area which can then really mitigate, really prevent, really inhibit then the ability to produce and apply those vertical forces is that lead shoulder, once again using that line placed on that lead shoulder address. When it gets excessively ahead of and remains in front of, it drives the pelvis down, it compresses that pelvis down, which then really reduces our ability to then both produce and apply those vertical forces. However, using that line on that kind of lead shoulder as we kind of move into that kind of downswing phase into impact, it's encouraging that lead shoulder to be really not moving excessively ahead of. It may move a little bit ahead of in transition, but certainly back to impact, pretty much in line with and on top of its start position. In some ways is the driver which then allows both the production of and the application of those vertical forces.